August 20th, 1941. A farm road south of Leningrad, running along a low embankment across open marsh near the state farm at Voyskovitsy. Two birch trees stand beside the verge. 40 yards back, inside a tree lean, in a pit dug through the night and covered over with cut branches, sits a Soviet heavy tank with its engine shut down. Only the top of the turret clears the ground. 5 men have been waiting in the dark since before dawn, and the racks around them hold roughly twice the normal load of ammunition, most of it armor-piercing. Down the road, German tanks are coming. They are light machines, 10.5 tons apiece, riveted plate, 37mm guns, moving in march column with their hatches open, because nothing in this sector has slowed them for weeks. The commander of the dug-in tank has already told the 4 other crews under his command to hold their fire. He wants the entire column up on that embankment before anyone shoots. His gunner has the lead vehicle framed against the birches. Then the order comes and the road stops being a road. To understand what happened on that embankment, you have to understand how bad the summer had been. Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, and Army Group North was given the shortest and most valuable road of the 3. It ran through the Baltic states and up to Leningrad, the second city of the Soviet Union, the birthplace of the revolution, and the site of the factory complex that built the Red Army's heaviest tanks. The Germans covered that ground faster than anyone on either side expected. By July, they were across the Luga River. By the middle of August, the Luga defensive line, dug by civilians with shovels through the summer, was coming apart, and whole Soviet armies were being cut off behind it. 5 rifle divisions, 2 divisions of Leningrad militia, and an armored division were closing into a pocket they would not escape from intact. What stood between the Panzer divisions and the city was a town called Krasnogvardeysk, today Gachina. It was the last fortified belt on the southwestern approach. If it fell quickly, there was very little behind it, and the Soviet forces holding it were exhausted, scattered, and short of nearly everything, including tanks. They were not short of one thing. In the summer of 1941, the German army was discovering that its standard anti-tank gun had stopped working. The 37mm piece that had knocked out French and Polish and Yugoslav armor could still kill most Soviet vehicles at 1,000 yards. Could not kill the 2 new designs. Against the T-34 and against the heavy tank we are about to meet, the shells simply came apart on the plate. German crews gave the gun a new name that stuck for the rest of the war. They called it the Panzereinklopfturret, the tank-knocking device. The door knocker. You could hit the target all day and announce your presence and achieve nothing else. The heavy tank in question was the KV, named for Kliment Voroshilov, Stalin's old comrade from the Civil War and the People's Commissar for Defense. It had been designed at the Kirov Factory in Leningrad and tested in the snow against the Mannerheim Line during the Winter War with Finland, where Soviet crews learned that a tank thick enough to walk through anti-tank fire was worth a great deal of trouble. The KV-1 weighed about 45 tons. Its hull front carried 75mm of steel, its sides the same, its welded turret 75mm as well, and there was nothing in a 1941 Panzer Division's normal inventory that could deal with that reliably. The main gun was a 76mm weapon, the F-32, firing an armor-piercing shell at roughly 612 meters per second, good for something in the region of 60 to 66 millimeters of penetration at 500 yards. That was more than enough for anything German with a Czech or a Panzer II badge on it. The standard ammunition load was 111 rounds. Power came from a V2K diesel, a 12-cylinder engine of 600 horsepower, which was itself unusual, because most armies were still running tanks on gasoline. Diesel burned slower when a hull was opened up. Crews noticed things like that. The tank had real faults, and they were not small ones. The transmission was the worst of them, stiff and fragile, and drivers were known to change gear with a hammer kept in the fighting compartment for exactly that purpose. At 45 tons, the KV broke bridges that lighter tanks crossed without thinking, and it sank into ground that looked firm. Early production machines broke down constantly, and in the summer of 1941 the Red Army lost far more KVs to abandoned engines and dry fuel tanks than to German gunnery. The KV was a superb tank to fight in and a miserable one to keep running. The Germans had already met one under bad conditions. In late June, on the road toward Rzyniai in Lithuania, a single KV parked itself across the supply route of a German battle group and stayed there most of a day. An anti-tank battery firing from close range accomplished nothing except the loss of its own guns. A 50mm crew crawled in and put rounds into the hull at ranges where missing was impossible, and the tank kept working. It took an 88mm anti-aircraft gun in the direct fire role to finish the job. Accounts of that day traveled fast through Army Group North, and by August every officer in the northern sector understood what a dug-in KV meant. It meant sending for the 88, assuming there was one within reach and time to bring it up. There was one more thing about the tanks around Leningrad. The Kirov Factory was still in the city, still building, and already preparing to evacuate east to Chelyabinsk. Somebody there decided the KV needed more armor, and there was no time to redesign anything, so the extra plates went on with bolts. The variant is known as the KV-1E, from the Russian word for screens, and roughly 200 or more were converted from about July 1941. 25mm plates were fixed over the glacis, over the turret sides, over the hull flanks, taking frontal protection to something near 100mm. The bolt heads are enormous and obvious in photographs. The screens cost the tank about 5 kilometers an hour off a top speed that was only 35 to begin with. Almost every one of them served on the Leningrad and northwestern fronts, because those were the only fronts they could reach. One of them was tank number 864. Her commander was Senior Lieutenant Zinoviy Kolobanov, born in 1911 in a village in Vladimir Governorate, conscripted in 1933, graduated with honors from the Up-armoured school in 1936. He had already been to war once. He fought through the Mannerheim Line in the Winter War, and after the armistice in March 1940 he was reprimanded and stripped of rank, reportedly demoted from captain, for what the paperwork treated as fraternizing with Finnish soldiers once the shooting stopped. He was back in a tank by 1941 with a lieutenant's authority and a company to run, the 3rd Tank Company of the 1st Tank Battalion, 1st Tank Division, holding the approaches to Krasnogvardeysk. On August 19th, his divisional commander gave him a simple instruction. 3 roads led into the town from the south and southwest. Block all 3. Kolobanov had 5 KV-1s to do it with. He split them among the roads, took the Luga road for himself, and went to look at the ground. What he found was better than a defensive position. It was a trap that only needed a gun. The road ran up onto a causeway across marshy ground, so a column on it could not turn off without bogging down. There was a grove at the edge of the swamp with a clean line of sight along the whole length of the embankment. He put tank 864 into a pit dug deep enough that the hull was buried, camouflaged it, and picked out 2 birch trees on the far verge as an aiming mark, so his gunner would have a fixed reference to range against rather than a guess. The crews loaded roughly double the usual ammunition, about 2/3 of it armor-piercing. His standing order to the other commanders was that no position gave itself away until a column was fully committed to its stretch of road. 5 tanks firing at once announce a defensive line, and a defensive line can be gone around. A single gun opening up from cover is an unknown quantity, and an unknown quantity has to be dealt with where it stands. The crew inside 864 were Senior Sergeant Andrei Yusov on the gun, Sergeant Major Nikolai Nikiforov driving, Red Army man Nikolai Rodenkov as junior driver and loader, and Senior Sergeant Pavel Koselkov on the radio and the hull machine gun. The German column came up the road in the morning, buttoned down for nothing, unaware there was anything ahead of them. Kolobanov let all of it climb onto the embankment. Only when the lead vehicle reached the birches did he give Yusov the order. The first rounds killed the tanks at the front. That was the entire idea. With the leaders burning on a narrow raised roadway, the column behind them could not get past. Then the fire shifted to the rear of the column and killed the tanks at the back, and everything in between was sealed onto a strip of dirt with marsh on both sides. Some crews tried to drive off the embankment and found out what a 10-ton tank with narrow tracks does to soft ground. Some dismounted and tried to fight the position with the guns they had, which were 37mm guns, against 100mm of bolted steel at a range where the shells could be heard hitting and nothing else happened. The rest of the company had its own version of the same morning on the other roads. Lieutenant Sergeyev's crew was credited with 8 tanks before their KV was disabled. Junior Lieutenant Degtyar's tank was credited with 3 and the vehicles supporting them. Junior Lieutenant Lastikin's crew was credited with 4, and 2 of those are recorded as rammed rather than shot, driven down by a driver named Iovlev, which tells you roughly how a 45-ton vehicle regards a 10-ton one once the armor-piercing rounds start running short. By the Soviet account, the engagement lasted about half an hour, and Tank 864 fired 98 armor-piercing rounds in it. The crew climbed out afterward and counted the strikes on their own armor. The figure recorded in the sources runs between 135 and 156 hits, and not one of them went through. The commander's periscope had been shot away. The tank was otherwise fit to drive home. The claim submitted for the action was 22 German tanks destroyed by Kolobanov's tank alone, with a second KV credited with 21 more, and the company's total for the day put at 42 or 43. And here the story has to slow down because those numbers deserve better than repetition. Soviet authorities at the time did not believe them either. Kolobanov was nominated for Hero of the Soviet Union, and the nomination was rejected as not credible on its face. He received the Order of the Red Banner instead, in February 1942. Yusov, the gunner who actually fired the 98 rounds, got the Order of Lenin. Nikiforov received the Order of the Red Banner, Rodenkov and Kiselkov the Order of the Red Star. The German paperwork does not confirm 43 tanks. Divisional records held on microfilm in the United States National Archives show the 1st Panzer Division reporting no notable fighting in its sector on the 19th and 20th of August. The 8th Panzer Division records no encounter with a Soviet heavy tank on the 19th, and exactly one on the 20th, where a 5-centimeter anti-tank gun was brought up to deal with it. The closest thing to a match is the 6th Panzer Division, which logs the loss of 7 Panzer 35 TS and 2 Panzer IVs on August 19th, and 1 more 35T on the 20th. That last entry is worth sitting with. The Panzer 35T was a Czech Skoda design, 10.5 tons, riveted, 37mm gun, narrow-tracked, and the 6th Panzer Division's tank regiment was the largest operator of the type in the German army that summer with around 75 of them. Light tanks with 37mm guns that bog and marsh is precisely what the Soviet account describes running into. Something one-sided happened on that road. The scale of it is a wartime claim written into a citation, and the surviving German ledgers count a smaller day. None of it saved the town. Krasnoye Selo fell on September 12th. Krasnogvardeysk fell on September 13th. Leningrad's last land connection to the rest of the country had already been cut on September 8th, and the siege that followed lasted 872 days and killed somewhere upward of 1 million people, most of them civilians, most of them from starvation. Kolobanov himself was wounded on September 15th near Pushkin, hit by an ammunition explosion, and his war effectively ended there. He returned to duty in 1945, too late to fight again. He lived a long and unremarkable life afterward. He retired a lieutenant colonel, worked at the Minsk Automobile Works, and died in Belarus in 1994 at the age of 83, half a century after the road at Voyskovitsy, in a country that no longer existed. A memorial was put up in 1980 at the spot where the pit was dug. They wanted a KV-1 for it and could not find one, because the tanks that made Leningrad summer survivable were nearly all used up in the doing of it. So there is an IS-2 standing there instead, a heavier tank from a later year, pointing down a quiet farm road where two birch trees used to mark the range.